Hello and welcome to The Appointment. I am Pranjal Sharma. Joining me today for a conversation is the president of the Apex Industry Chamber of Commerce, FICCI, and its president, Mr. Harshvardhan Neotia. Mr. Neotia, thank you so much for being with us today. You've taken charge recently, Mr. Neotia, and there is a lot of discussion and debate about what direction the economic growth should take place. Some of the expectations are not being met. But let me begin by asking you, how do you see the current profile of India's economy?
Well, if you look at it in the context of the world, we are certainly pretty decently off. If you look at it in the context of what we would like to be and what I think are the aspirations of the Indian people, we are behind. We are behind because I think we have the potential to grow. I think we can do a lot better. And there are things that need to be done to push this forward.
When you say that there are things to be done, I'd like to come to some of those ideas because in the last 18 months or so, the Narendra Modi government has made a lot of announcements, taken a few steps. Where would you say is the impact of the steps taken so far?
So, what do we need as business? Essentially, you want the ease of doing business, and the other is the cost of doing business. When you talk about the ease of doing business, I think the government itself put a rather interesting task before itself to say that they would like to be amongst the 50 top countries in the world instead of being in 136 or whatever the rank was. And I think we moved somewhat up on that. But it's whether it's the procedures, whether it's the licensing, whether it's the permits, it's a whole lot of maze of things. Of course, GST is one of those things that unifies India as one market, and a host of other things. So we can get into those details. But a lot of work has happened, and a lot needs to be done. For instance, the Companies Act in its present form requires a review on certain provisions. I understand that there is a proposal to be placed before Parliament, and that would help in easing this whole process of ease of doing business. The other piece in the puzzle is about the cost of doing business. Now, what is the reason for our cost to be high? Essentially, infrastructure is one of the major areas, and that's where government coming in to improve roads, ports, railways, etc. are critical to reduce the cost of doing business. For instance, greater improvement in river and sea transportation can bring down logistics costs significantly. Better connectivity from ports to railways to roads can improve logistics costs considerably. So there are areas of infrastructure where we have issues.
We are moving forward, but perhaps the pace of movement is not enough, and there is a growing sense in the industry, and I think therefore the consumers also, that the patience and the hope are wearing thin. What can be done to hold on to that hope and patience?
Well, it's not going to be easy to get an elephant like India to dance, and I think all of us have to be aware of that. I think the expectations were quite unreasonably built. I think even we sort of thought there's a magic wand to fix all this. Neither is such a wand there, nor is it possible.
But is it also that the industry and the government perhaps overestimated our situation, the economic situation, and when you started looking at it closer, you realized that things were worse than what we had imagined?
Possibly. I mean, I won't be able to answer for government because I don't have access to all that information. But say, for instance, the stress in the banking sector is certainly a lot larger than popularly estimated. Now, I'm sure the banking system may be aware, or some people in government may be aware, but from outside, we didn't seem to think it's as big as it now appears to be. That is indeed a drag. So there is some need to fix that. Of course, all of that is not necessarily mismanagement or whatever. Some of them could be global and cyclical factors. Some of them could be clearances and issues held up like that. But it's a mixed bag of those that have defaulted by mismanaging and those that have got caught into a cyclical storm.
What is needed today to spark the revival of the domestic investment cycle? So, having laid out the ecosystem and the challenges within that, what needs to be done to bring that domestic investment back on track?
So there are 3-4 things. First of all, I think we need to first bring in significant public expenditure in the infrastructure space to then crowd in the private investment. So typically whenever there is a slowdown in the economy, the government kind of has to take the lead initiative to catalyze that investment. The second is that to work faster on reforms, be it in making the processes simpler, and not all of them need legislative inputs. A lot of them can be perhaps done through administrative processes. So look at them and see how we can address issues that are holding back development. The third is, of course, to increase consumption and to increase rural demand. And for that, we certainly hope that we will not be third time unlucky and there would be a good monsoon going forward. But beyond that, to see how we can de-risk our crop from rain, and therefore irrigation and the interlinking of rivers as one of the ideas all need to be worked on. Of course, as you would say, that this is not short term, certainly not, but then you have to make a beginning. Finally, sustainable ideas will take some time to fructify.
Mr. Neotia, the role of the state government is equally important, and there is an increasing momentum on cooperative and competitive federalism. We see every state launching these investor summits. There's a lot of focus on bringing foreign investors. At the ground, has it made a difference to businesses? Are they feeling more encouraged to work with the state governments? Are they putting their money on the ground into basic new projects?
Simply answered yes. I'll tell you why. First of all, I think this is a fantastic idea to allow the states to compete. I think a lot of logjam that gets created can get sorted out by allowing the states to compete with one another. I'd also like to say that no matter what the role of the center is in terms of policy, the action will always be in the states. So the states have to certainly come on board. The fact that the states have started having investor summits is also a very interesting phenomenon. And the reason why I say it's interesting is not because of the song and dance that happens on those two or 3 days, but is as a run-up to that, every state is looking at clearing things which would normally have often taken a lot longer time.
Is it fair to say that today, investor summits have been happening for 25 years, perhaps the frequency has increased and perhaps the number of states doing that has also increased? Is it that today the competition between states is not just on tax incentives, but on facilitating businesses and procedures and clearances? Do you see that shift taking place, which perhaps would be more important than just pure, subsidies and incentives?
I do feel that the relevance of subsidies and investment has come down significantly. I do think that it's more important about the speed of clearance, it's more important about infrastructure, access to water, electricity, land, etc. So those are the more critical issues. And of course, industries today are not going to go like in the past based on license and permit. They will go to either a place which is at the home of the raw material or where there is a big market. And of course, when you look at that, you look at the necessary skills available to
the talent.
So it's really a combination of those that are going to decide location of factories. But within that, you obviously have a play. It's not like there's only one location where this thing will work. So you have an option, and within that option set, you will look for the most competitive environment where you have the ease of doing business most significantly better. And that's where the states come in. And I think when they have these investor summits, there is a kind of run-up, the top leadership of the state gets involved, They don't want investors to come there and complain about problems that they have faced. So as a consequence, there is it's like a spring cleaning that you would do in your home because you're having some important function happening there. You'd probably make it shine up a little better than you would normally have done.
Also, you know, the issue, and you used a great term of spring cleaning, the money locked in litigation, the money locked in judicial processes, the money locked in the pending projects, these are the ones which could unlock a lot of momentum and value for the economy, both at the state level and the central level. Do you think enough has been done on this front?
Well, we'll have to go back a step on this. Of course, to answer your question, there is a lot locked up and it certainly needs correction. But why do we have so much of litigation? Well, fundamentally, a lot of the laws that have been promulgated or put in place are on the basis of distrust. I don't trust you, to be honest, and therefore I have norms like that. Similarly, the system operates by saying that whoever is in power is not going to allow me to do something, so I'm going to find a way to do it. I think there is possibly it was the case when we were ruled by a foreign nation, and maybe those situations existed in that context. I was not born in that point of time, so I have no idea how the thing operated. But I feel that there is a case to revisit this whole approach. And I'm not trying to blame either the government or the private sector. I think both have exploited each other as the opportunity came. And therefore, we have a distrust as an environment. And therefore, there is a philosophical issue that needs to be corrected first. I mean, now obviously a philosophical issue is not going to be corrected merely by change in laws. It's first to change the way we look at each other. Are we looking at each other as partners or as adversaries? And therefore, does our document of contract between us relate to a relationship that is more likely to work than not, or is it by an exception a relationship that is intended to be hostile?
And I think in your position as the leader and head of Apex Chamber of Commerce, I think you would probably want to put a lot of stress on bringing the trust to a higher level, reducing the trust deficit. But it's not an easy task because you're battling a very strong legacy of mistrust.
Certainly, but then, you know, such is life. Anything that is going to be of a cataclysmic nature, and certainly a change from an old mindset, is a very long and arduous process, but it has to begin somewhere. And the only thing that we as FICCI could attempt to do is to set it rolling in that direction. It may be several years before we can see some progress, but we need to move, and that we need to move because it is probably a better idea on how to look at the development of our nation.
Mr. Neotia, the industry sectors which could drive growth in the economy, which are the ones which you think? Because, you know, in the last few months, the defense sector has been open to domestic private sector. Aerospace is seeing a lot of activity. A lot of new thoughts are coming through. But which are the ones you think have the best potential of being the engines of growth?
Well, looking at India's context, I would say infrastructure and housing. Housing, because we have a very large population, a very large number of them that would migrate from rural areas to urban areas, and all of them require housing. And government also has a mission of housing for all by 2022. Housing requires about nearly 150 industries depend on housing, because right from a door to a window to a sanitary fitting to cement to steel to flooring tiles to what have you. So if there is a way that we can bring affordable housing and give it a boost, it not only serves the need of the people, but also helps in spurring the demand across almost all sectors of the economy. The other, of course, which is critical in our country is infrastructure. We all know that the cost of logistics and the time taken to get from one place to another
The value chain, it's
quite significant. I mean, it is, the logistic costs in India are a lot higher than it is anywhere else. And that is so because our infrastructure is poor, we take a lot longer time, the rolling stock is not of that quality, of course even the roads and rails and what have you. And we are not using our waterways very effectively, particularly the Sagarmala, let's say, was a concept of linking ports. That's something that could really transform transportation, at least of bulk commodities. So if we can put effort and money into infrastructure, we can bring a lot of economies of scale. And of course, the third area which is very important is renewable energy. And I do feel that there is a possibility of renewable energy bringing that very critical fillip to India. Of course, we have a lot of support now with oil prices having come down, but it is quite possible that in the next 10 to 15 years, we may not need to depend on hydrocarbon imports if we can develop our own alternate energy sources. So that's another area that we could work on very significantly.
Which I think some work is already being done, but again, as you said, and we all agree that I think the pace of change needs to be speeded up. And as Finance Minister Arun Jaitley is again looking at the budget, I know it's an annual exercise, but something which a lot of experts say doesn't need to be annual. It has to be a more long-term, vision on where the economy is. Some of it has been laid out by the Prime Minister, but my question to you is that at this point where the government has done some and part of its term is still left over, what are the issues you would like them to prioritize? So you mentioned some, but in terms of policy changes, there have been a lot of stress on skilling, but now, for example, helping startups, creating a more enabling environment. Is there something which you think the government has not considered, which it must put on the table?
Well, I don't think so, because the government has flagged off pretty much all the issues, and there are obviously no easy solutions. And the good news is that I don't have to do this very difficult job because there are too many competing claimants to very limited resources and perhaps very limited fiscal room that the finance minister has. But broadly from industry, we would say keep the momentum on public investment high, try to see that the subsidies are targeted to those who are needy so that the wasteful subsidies are reduced.
How do you see the, how much time do you think it will take for the momentum and the optimism on the ground to return? The cost and the ease that you referred to earlier in our conversation is coming down, but at a pace perhaps which is not making everybody happy. Is there a sense you have that whether it will take another 6 months or another year or 12 months for the domestic investment cycle to come back?
Well, if I had an accurate answer for that, I would be India's most valuable soothsayer. So I don't have it. But having said that, I remain optimistic that we will at least move around in the right direction. I don't see something dramatic or something galloping to happen. That's also particularly because the international headwinds seem to be strong and also seem to be very uncertain.
So are you apprehensive about capital flows to India now, because between foreign capital flows and domestic public investment, these two could have boosted and encouraged domestic investors also to put their money on the table?
No, it's funny that sometimes the fact that the world is having some difficulties could also be an opportunity for us, as much as the fact that you're interlinked globally and therefore the difficulties also spill into you. Now, how exactly it will pan out, it would be difficult for me to guess, but my sense is that India still remains a little more attractive a market than many other markets in the world. So I do see that some fund flow will happen. It may not happen as much as we want, as speed at which we want, but I do see a positive trend, and we have seen it over the last 2 years that the trend has been on the upswing, and therefore I feel it will continue in that direction. We could have done a lot better if the world was supporting We are aware that there are difficult times there. So we'll have to just live with it.
But there's never a perfect set of conditions.
Sure, and that's fine. But we also have to be conscious that every condition does impact you.
My final question is, Mr. Neotia, that people also feel that Indian industry does not want to take risk. It wants what I was referring to as a perfect set of conditions, and then they will step up and you know, put their money into projects and put their own money into investing in the projects they believe in, and not just public money or borrowed money. Do you think that Indian industry also needs to be far more risk-taking than it has been? Perhaps look at the long term and not just a short-term return?
Certainly, and I do believe that today's Indian enterprise has been built on this whole idea of risk-taking. In fact, there are enough stories written about the fact that Indian enterprise has taken very, very large risks to build India's capability. I don't see any reason that people will shy away from that. I think it's more about the inability to invest than the lack of interest to invest. And when I say inability, is because they have either excess capacities. It's very difficult to justify to a board that you have an excess capacity which you are not able to utilize because the demands are not that high, and then you are going and setting up a new factory. The other is that the balance sheets are stretched, partly because the excess capacity is has locked up your funds, and partly also because the prices have been subdued. So as a result, there is a stress on your income. So I think it's a combination of these factors in general. Now, that's not to say that there won't be some stories of some companies in different aspects, and I'm sure there must be some truth to what you're saying with respect to some. But in general, if you ask me, my sense is more about the inability, because of stretched balance sheets, leveraged positions, and overcapacity available, rather than the lack of desire. Because tell me which other space is there for anyone to invest in.
Correct. Mr. Neotia, thank you so much for being with us, and my best wishes to you for your tenure as the President of FICCI.